In this session, we look at how to present new language items. Now, notice that we don't use the word teach, we use the word present, and this has something to do with the methodology today for teaching grammar. And language items, the term is often used to mean grammar items. The first question to ask is, where do the grammar items come from? Now, remember that under the current task-based learning framework, the task is the starting point for planning a unit of works. Say, for example, the task is riddles. So from this task, we try to identify what language items are needed for students to complete this task. A number of almost synonymous terms are being used in the literature. So sometimes you will hear language item, sometimes you will hear language structure, sometimes sentence structure, and sometimes grammar item. Most of the time they mean more or less the same thing, but note that what counts as a grammar item for teaching may not be the same as a topic in a grammar reference book. Recall that the ultimate goal for teaching a second language is so that students will be able to communicate in a target language. So when we teach a grammar item, our ultimate objective is so that students will be able to use that grammar item for spontaneous use. So that's why today the most common model for teaching grammar is what is known as the PPP model. Under the PPP model, presentation is the first phase when we present a new language item to the students. So now, say you have a new grammar item to present to students. For example, simple present tense or demonstratives like this, that, these, those, or a sentence structure like there is, there are. So what do we need to present in connection with a new language item? And today, we usually think of presentation as comprising, presenting the form, the meaning, and sometimes the function of the target language item. So what is meant by form? Form is the surfaced linguistic form of a language item. So for example, how do we recognize a verb phrase as present perfect tense? Well, because it has the form, which is like has or have, followed by a past participle. So that is the form of the present perfect tense. Past continuous tense, so the form is was or were, followed by an ing verb. Meaning is meaning is expressed by the linguistic form. So, for example, when we have the form there is versus there are, so what meaning is being expressed through this structure? So when we use the language form like, for example, going to, so what meaning is expressed by going to? Communicative function is what purpose we want to achieve by using the target structure. So when you say, I wish I knew the answer, why are you saying I wish I knew the answer and not I hope I know the answer? So let's look at more examples of language form. For example, in the simple present tense, like, and sometimes likes, and then in the negative, doesn't like. And then countable nouns versus uncountable nouns. we have biscuits, which is countable, plural, and then we have juice, and then tag questions, like, for example, we need isn't, if the main verb of the sentences is, and does in the tag, if the main verb is doesn't. Let's look at examples of meaning. So 1a is what we usually call type 1 conditional sentence, and 1b type 2. But what is the difference in meaning between 1a and 1b? What about the difference in meaning between 2a and 2b? And what do people mean when they say, I'm loving it, as opposed to, I love it? Examples of communicative functions. So we have the form, would you like to? But why do we say, would you like to? So in a social situation, why do we use an expression like, would you like to? Or I was wondering if we could. So now you can try analyzing the past perfect tense. So in terms of form, what does the past perfect tense consist of? How can we tell that a verb is in the past perfect tense? And when we see a verb phrase like had done, had gone, had seen, what does that mean? And why do we use the past perfect tense rather than, say, the simple past tense? In each new unit in the course book, there is usually one language item or sometimes two, and so we need to decide on the importance of the new structure and how much time to put into it, because sometimes even though it appears as a new structure in the course book, students may be very familiar with it already. The next thing is that sometimes a new structure may not really be that new because the teacher might have used it in her day-to-day teaching, so that students have heard the new structure many times. So one example is, say, for example, I'm going to, all right, which the teacher might have used many times in her day-to-day teaching. So if that is the case, that is, when you're faced with a half-learned structure, you may not need to present it. Instead, you can just elicit the structure from students. So what it means is that you can ask a question to see if students can, to see how well the students can use it in response. And new important structures, if it is a new and important structure, then the next phase under the PPP model is practice. So don't think that because you have presented it, then your job is done, because listening to your presentation is only the first step of learning a new grammar item. And when we present a new language item, always think of a context. So in this case, think of a situation in real life when we will need to use that target structure. And if we present the new structure through a context, then students will be able to understand the meaning easily. And when we present a new language item, it's important to get the students' attention. So usually it is done orally, and then we show the written form later. Another thing to note is don't just present the form, present the meaning as well. So for example, you're presenting the present perfect tense, so don't present the form like has or have versus the past participle. But why? Why do we use the present perfect tense? What meaning is captured by the present perfect tense. And there's a variety of techniques that we can use for presenting a new language item. Sometimes we can use a dialogue, sometimes we can use a demonstration. So vary the presentation technique to avoid boredom. And if necessary, give the grammar items or the grammar terms when you summarize your presentation. Sometimes teachers think of teaching grammar as providing students with metalinguistic explanations. So, for example, if they are teaching the articles a and the, if they rely on verbal metalinguistic explanation, they might say that, okay, a and these are indefinite articles, and we use the indefinite articles the first time we mention something, and then when we mention something again, then we use the definite article the. Now, this is an example of metalinguistic explanation. You may use it, but don't rely on it. And even if you use it as a summary, and don't use it as a presentation technique. So let's look at some examples of problem metalinguistic explanation. This kind of explanation is not just boring, and very often they are ambiguous and even inaccurate. So these are some common techniques for presenting a new language item. So what do we exactly do in the classroom? So we can start with a context. Remember, a context is a situation. So, for example, some children playing in the park, or two boys having a fight, or some children having a lesson in the school. So these are contexts. And then, after presenting the context, present examples, sentences from the contexts. And after you have presented 2 to 3 examples of the target structure, use questioning to check that students have understood. And if necessary, present further examples. Now at this stage, you can write the example sentences on the board so that students can see the form of the target structure, the new target structure, more easily. And then, of course, the next step is the next phase in the PPP model, which is practice. I mentioned earlier that even though a language item may appear as a new item in the course book, it may be a half-learned structure. And so if that is the case, you don't need to actually present it, and instead you can use a technique which is called elicitation. So it involves giving cues in the form of questions, gestures, pictures, facial expressions, incomplete sentences, to see if students can already more or less give you the sentence. If they can, then you don't need to bother about presenting it as if it was new.